Good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock, time to get started. One housekeeping item or two before we begin. This is our final class for this series. If you had looked on the website that advertised this program, I had said we would have another session later in the spring, or late spring, early summer, to talk about the fall crops. There is a possibility we can try to do that face-to-face or a hybrid where if those that are close enough want to come and be in person and the rest of the group can Zoom in, that's a possibility. And we'll work out the details on trying that approach the next few weeks. But I had scheduled that for the first part of June. I figured we cover all the aspects of getting started with your garden in the spring of the year, give you an opportunity to start gardening, and then come back together for a bonus session later in the season to answer questions and to follow up on things to do in the fall. Also, along with announcements, coming up on Saturday, April the 17th, our Master Gardeners are planning a program at the Dunlap Coke Ovens, and we were going to talk about native trees and try to learn to identify some of the trees in our area. And the program will start around 10 o'clock Central Time. I will send out more details on that event. We plan on having our program in the morning and a brown bag lunch picnic for those that would want to stay and enjoy a bit of fellowship. And then I understand the Coke Ovens Museum will also be open, and there will be someone there, those who might want to tour the Coke Ovens. So that's an opportunity for you all to get together with the Master Gardeners and meet some of the faces that that you have seen and heard, but may not have actually got a chance to actually meet in person. All right, as I transition my slides to our first session, we're going to talk a little bit about gardening in small spaces this evening and a little bit on composting. So two different topics that we're going to be covering. Okay, so we're going to begin with small space gardening and a little bit about how to utilize certain techniques that can help maximize your space. So we're going to discuss a little bit about how to go small, some basics regarding raised beds and managing those raised beds, and containers, and then some final notes on some cultivars to consider if you are deciding to go on a smaller scale. There's a lot of new cultivars and varieties that have been developed in the last few years that can easily be grown in containers. So let's start talking about the first question. Why would you want a small space garden? Well, first of all, it makes it easy and quite possible to garden no matter where you may be. Be a very efficient way to use the space that you have. In many cases, these small garden spaces, a couple of raised beds or a few containers, can be more accessible than a typical in-ground garden. You're able to control your environment easier. You have a lot more control on the mix that you place in the container or in the raised bed. And we'll talk about some other things you can manage as well. And being small, it's not that overwhelming in the work that you have to do. There are things that work really well in these small spaces. Short season crops that can be sequentially planted. These could be such things as radishes and beets. Beans and corn now, they can be sequentially planted to extend your harvest window as well. But some of the smaller crops that are very short in their time, particularly leafy crops, do really well. Peppers and tomatoes can be good for those small spaces, because if you manage the plant, it can produce a lot of fruit, particularly if it's an indeterminate over a long period of time. Herbs are also plants that work really well in these small spaces. And that works really well because, one, you don't use a lot of herbs and you don't need a lot of plants. So having them in a small area or a container makes them easier to manage. And they can also be fairly expensive to buy and place in a garden. And then to turn around and have something come along and eat them where you can't protect them if they're in a container or maybe in one of these raised beds. So using containers or raised beds that are close to or in your backyard, very close to the house, makes it very easy for you to have what you need when you need it. Containers also gives you an opportunity to manage light and airflow. If it's in a container, you can easily move. And there's some things you can do to extend the season using containers and raised beds that you may not be able to do in ground. However, there are some challenges. Not every crop is going to work this way. Not all the crop, well, since you're growing small quantities in small spaces, this is not something that you would want to have you plan on preserving and canning your vegetables and putting up for the winter. This is really great for fresh crops during season. Vine crops can be very hard to manage in these settings because they take up space. And then there are some crops that the benefits of putting them in a small place is really not worth it because the work or the cost of maintaining them. Corn, for example, would not be very easily done in a small space. So let's talk about the basics in building. So first thing you need to think about is, does your home have a lawn site for a raised bed? If you answer yes, then there's some other questions that comes along with what we discussed in the first session in selecting a site. Is there enough light? Is the soil usable? And is it accessible? Accessible for you to work and accessible for you to water? If you answered yes to those questions, then you may have a good place for a garden and even a raised bed. If you answered no, or I don't want to raise bed, then maybe you have a porch or a patio that is accessible and usable. And how much light does that area get? If you answered no, but still want to garden and don't have the space for an in-ground, we'll get to that with the containers. So if you answered yes, then here's some information you need to consider. First of all, how large a growing area are you going to need to begin with? If you start small, you can always expand. Sometimes if you get too big to start with, then you're going to be discouraged and have a lot more work than you intend. It's probably easier to add than it is to take away. Some other things to keep in mind. These are temporary or can be temporary, particularly if you used soil in the raised bed, but they can be very long-term and even permanent. It does take time to build these raised beds. Even the temporary beds can take a little bit of time and labor to construct. the materials you choose can determine the usefulness and the lifespan of the raised bed that you are building. So you need to think about the materials you're using. Something keeping in mind is when you are building, it needs to be able to withstand the weight of the material that is in the container, as well as the plants. Raised beds can be made without structure. They can be temporary raised beds, and many truck farms on a large scale use a similar principle by creating a mound or bed in their fields. And this can be done by hand as well, so that you can create a temporary raised area to grow crops. Just like a regular garden, you're going to need at least 8 hours, 7 to 8 hours of sun. Then think about if you don't have that, there are crops you can consider, such as the leafy vegetables and some of the greens. 6 hours of sunlight, they can manage fairly well. And we discussed the details of how much light in session 1 in the first part of that class. So you can go back and review. As you know, I've put the videos up on YouTube, and you have access to them with the links that I've shared. Something else to consider. The people aspect. Do you have the time to invest in maintaining this? How big of an area do you need for the people in the household? Is it going to be stuck somewhere that if you don't see it regularly, you're going to forget about it and not water it or weed it as you need to? And how accessible is it for you to water the plants, harvest, and even renovate the beds periodically? You may have to add media to the raised beds from time to time. So how accessible will the site be? So building materials. You've got several options. Untreated wood can be a possibility, and it can be painted. You only need to think about the fact that paint will need to be reapplied frequently, depending on the type of wood and how it weathers and the type of paint you use. Prior to about 2004, pressure treated wood was treated with chromated copper acetate. These, however, are no longer used. So the newer treated woods have less potential to leach these heavy metals. However, you need to decide if that's something you want to do or not. The treated woods can be a possibility. There are many species of trees that are fairly resistant to decay, such as your conifer species. They can be used untreated. You may have to purchase lumber at a lumber yard that may not carry the species that you're looking for. Red cedar, fir. In West Tennessee, they use cypress. These materials are fairly resistant to decay and work very well in a raised bed. You can use landscape timbers. In fact, if you want to go with fairly shallow beds, they work very, very well on a raised bed. Concrete blocks can work very well. There are materials that are plastic or composite that may also be used to build your raised bed. Tyrex and some of these other boards are good options. They may not have the strength to support a long run in a bed, so they may bow if they don't have enough support in the bed itself. So think about the material and how well it's going to withstand the material. So the other things you need to consider: how tall will the crops be? Deeper rooted warm season crops should have a bed that's 8 to 12 inches deep, or that allows the roots to grow into the soil below. Some of your more shallow rooted crops, such as your leafy crops, leaf lettuce and such, a 6 to 8 inch bed would be more than sufficient. But if you have a shallow bed, which works really well for the leafy crops, they're going to dry out much quicker. So you may have to pay attention to the soil moisture. Taller beds, 1 to 3 feet, can provide quite a bit of rooting space and volume, can create issues with drainage if the native soil is used. And the deeper beds may require a media that drains really well. However, a taller bed may make it easier to reach. But having that 1 to 3 feet of rooting volume, you would have to water less. But when you do water, they are going to require a thorough watering. So they may require more money on growing media up front. Think about this. The water moves the soil quite differently than we might think. So if you have a raised bed that's anywhere from the 6 inches up to the 3 foot that we mentioned, and it's all the same material throughout the bed, when you water that bed and you water it evenly, the water will move evenly through that media until it reaches a different textured media that may be the native soil, at which point it quits moving down and starts moving laterally. And it will start filling up from the bottom of that layer until it reaches enough pressure to push itself into that next level. We often think if it's a sandy soil on the bottom and a fine textured media on the top, then the water will run right through when it reaches the sand. It won't. It will stop at the sand, spread out along the surface of the sand, and then start moving through the sand, which could hold water longer than you would want in your media. So I would suggest that you keep the media in your raised beds the same for the rooting depth that you require for the crops that you are growing. Some things to think about when it comes to installation will be the soil, to level or not to level. What about pathways and access and the spacing around them? So do you use your native soil on your site? If you have a desirable soil to start with, it's medium textured, well-drained, fertile, and it's considered a sandy loam, then it may be ideal for even adding to the raised beds. However, if it's a clay soil, it's been hard to work, it's full of gravel, it crusts over when it rains or doesn't drain at all, has a lot of rock or debris, then it's not likely going to be something that you would want to add to your raised bed. In fact, you're probably considering a raised bed to avoid the problem, so why add it to your raised bed? So let's discuss some options if you can't use the native soil that's in the area. Raised beds, you can find soils that can be purchased or bought, transported in. You can use a soilless mix, and you can even use the container gardening with soilless mix. So you've got options. So in raised beds, if it's going to be a shallow bed, maybe the 6 to 8 inches, then your native soils definitely can be used. But if you're going to have deeper soils, then you might want to mix 1 part native soil, 1 part compost or peat moss, and 1 part vermiculite or perlite to create a mix that will work well in your raised beds. Start getting over about 8 inches in depth or so, then you may want to think about a mix. If you're going to buy your soilless mixes, then you need to think about the source and make sure it comes from a trusted source. It's commonly used in the deep beds, and it's typically 1 part peat, 1 part compost, and 1 part vermiculite. You know, your deeper beds should have a mix with larger size particles or pieces, such as pine bark. They help improve the drainage as well. And you need to think about, let me back up 1 slide. It says from a trusted source. If you were to go and look at what is sold in any store that sells potting mixes or pre-mixed raised bed mixes, you can find a variety of brands and a variety of materials. Something to think about is if it looks wet and mushy and compacts in your hand when you squeeze it and feels kind of hard in the bag, chances are that's what it's going to be. Actually, there's no chance. It will be that way in your raised bed. If it feels light and fluffy, even if it's wet, it doesn't stick together, doesn't have a lot of large, obvious particles in it, you may have a good source material to use in your mix. Peat moss can be hard to wet initially because it tends to repel water. But it does, once you get it in the mix and get it wet down the first time, it works really well in a soilless mix. Perlite is simply a rock that has been superheated and is quite light, and it increases the pore space and drainage in your mix. So that's something to think about and to add. Vermiculite is a type of clay mineral that has been heated to expand the clay layers, and it can hold a large amount of water. When it comes to the compost, make sure it is well composted compost. Compost that is no longer heating. And make sure there are no residual herbicides or weed seeds that are in the compost. We'll talk more about your composting at the end of this session, in the last part. But again, when it comes to compost, a well-aged compost is what you're looking for. You know, we don't have nice machines in our home gardens to mix like they do on the commercial level. But you can mix these materials dry, and you can do so by hand, maybe on a tarp with a shovel, or pour them in layers in the bed and work them with a fork or a shovel as well. So they can easily be mixed, but they need to be dry while you're mixing. They get really hard to work when they are moistened. Once you've got it thoroughly mixed, then you can moisten it or wet it to prepare the bed for planting. Make sure there's no active decomposition that is still taking place. As we noted, the compost needs to be thoroughly decomposed. Moisten well, but you don't want the raised bed to be soaked. So a well moistened bed is what you're looking for. And plan your spacing. So think about the plants, how big they're going to be when they're mature, and space them accordingly in the bed. To give you some idea as the spacing, and these are some general estimates, but plants such as beans, beets, carrots, radishes, peas, I don't want to read the whole list, you can see it there. 2 to 4 inches between plants or seeds is all that you need. And if you're going with basil or Swiss chard or small head lettuce, even strawberries or kale, you're going to need about 6 to 8 inches between the plants or seed. Cabbage, you're going to need close to 18 inches between the plants. Peppers and tomatoes, 12 to 18 inches between. There are some tomato plants, depending on particularly some of the indeterminate, your winter squash and okra that can need up to 18 inches. Of course, okra may not be the best choice for a raised bed because it can get pretty tall to start with. Watermelons is one of those viney crops that will take a lot of space for itself if you're not careful. So they need the space, and so think about as you plant what you actually need or will have when it's complete. So you're thinking about it in terms of square feet. Then this is another chart. And someone asked, is this info in the seed packets relatively accurate? And it is. It is typically accurate for the plant that you're planting from the seed packet. So that's a good guide as well. You know, muskmelons and vining squash, you know, one plant per 2 square feet. Broccoli and cabbage, a plant per square foot. Cucumber, you might get by with 2 plants per square foot. Small beets, carrots, onions, radishes at the end, you have several plants per square foot. So depending on how big the plant gets, how big the fruit gets, the more space again that you will need. So think about the spacing. By the way, this particular chart came from the All New Square Foot Gardening book. So if you happen to have that reference. So those are some considerations for preparing and planting your raised bed. So let's talk about managing the bed. Crop support is going to be needed in your raised beds, just as they would be in any garden. Cages and the stake and twine method that we talked about, panels for support, all of these may be necessary in a raised bed as well. We discussed this, I think, in session 4 with Dr. Baumgartner. In having the raised beds, there's a couple of ways you can set up your trellising system with raised beds. They can be in the bed itself, as the picture on the left is. You notice the posts are set in the bed itself, and then you can't really see the twine or the wire that forms the trellis. Here, it's nailed to the outside with the supports on the side, and the plants are planted in the bed and then come out to the side of the bed and up to the panel. Now, this picture really doesn't show all that is there, because if you look carefully at the top, it looks like the panel is bent. These are cattle panels. They come in 16-foot lengths. So what they've done is they've bent it up over their head and back down to a bed on the other side to match, creating a arbor type setting. So the plants are going up, and you can walk down the middle of the arbor. And then, of course, on the side of the outside as well. So you can pick from the inside of the arbor or outside. Also, as you're looking at this picture, you notice there's tomatoes that are getting started in the middle, while there's green onions along the edge that are probably getting close to ready to harvest. So what they've done is they've started the onions in the bed, may have harvested out of the middle, and then went and set their young tomato plants in. As the tomatoes filled in, the onions came out, so they can have a succession of plantings in the same bed and have something growing all the time in the bed. We've discussed the need for water and having available water and a good source of water, hopefully without carrying a lot of buckets. And some of the irrigation methods that we talked about 2 or 3 weeks ago work very well. in a raised bed. May work better in a raised bed in some cases because you're watering a much smaller area for the plants. Keep in mind the pressure and amount of volume that you can have, and make sure you have access to maybe a water hose as well. And make sure you have the water when they need it. And the same methods of irrigation that we discussed a couple of weeks ago can work in raised beds and containers. And the drip tapes and drip lines, soaker hoses, as well as the overhead, as well as the method of just simply walking down the raised beds with a garden hose and watering each plant as you go along. Fertilizing works very much the same way as we did discuss with the traditional garden. You can use the granular fertilizers. You can use a soluble fertilizer. That can be something you can mix and then water the plants with, or have some way of watering a hose end, a sprayer for your, or even in the irrigation system itself. If you're using compost and organic materials as a part of your mix, they have nutrients as well and can be a fertilizer source in your raised bed. You can even use cover crops in raised beds. Tilling raised beds can be difficult, so you'll need likely to incorporate by hand, or you can simply cut them down and leave them laying on top of the raised bed as a mulch. Or another option is you can select crops that are going to be killed in the winter, something that may grow in the fall, and after the first good hard freeze or heavy frost, get nipped back so they're not overgrowing your raised bed. And some of the radishes fall into that category. So you've got some options with cover crops. Rotation in your raised beds is just as important as it would be in a traditional garden. And rotating those crops by families can be important. You're going to need to add media over time. The substrate or the material that you use will settle over time, and there will be some deterioration of the materials as well. So that it looks like it's sinking, and it is. So you will need to add or refresh that as well. Some people simply just keep adding material on the top. Sometimes folks will renovate or remove and start fresh with material as well, or mix fresh material in with the old. Something else to think about. If you answer no to having a spot for a raised bed, then there's still things you can do. Containers, typically using a soilless mix, or you could go with a solution or hydroponic system. Let's talk a little bit about containers. The containers work really well if there's no usable site or soil. Conditions are not suitable for you to grow a garden. Because of some physical limitations, the containers can be much easier to maintain than a large raised bed or a large garden. Containers may not require the time that a full-size garden or several raised beds. They're very flexible and portable, and you may just simply like the having a few things growing instead of a large garden. Containers are going to be more sensitive to temperature and moisture. By the fact that because there is such a small volume of soil or soilless media in the pot, the plants will dry out quicker, and the pot and its contents will heat and cool quicker because, as it says, there's less soil or media to buffer for the temp in the water. You can go with plastic or wood containers. Plastic holds water well because there's less evaporation. The lighter colors can be cooler and the darker colors can be warmer. And that can be both advantages and disadvantages. You know, a darker colored container started early in the season can warm up and grow plants quicker than a light colored one. And when you get into the summer, some of your crops may be in a lighter colored pot so that they don't overheat. Wood can be a good insulator against temperature swings. It can be much harder to clean and can be heavy to transport. And wood will, of course, deteriorate over time. So you've got options, and there is no right or wrong in that. You just need to think about the cost, the weight, and the size of the pot that you're going to be needing. Even in containers, drainage is very, very important. And you may have known folks to put gravel in the bottom of their containers to improve the drainage. Well, that does not work. So when I said happens in the soil or in your raised beds, will also happen in your pot. The water will follow the material until it comes to a change in texture or change in material. It'll spread out at the break between these two materials and then begin moving into the next layer. So gravel will not improve your drainage. So again, find a consistent material that works well. Just in the same criteria we talked about for your raised bed works for your containers when it comes to medium. Some other things to think about for container options would be terracotta or clay pots. They do dry out faster than plastic and wood. They can have an advantage of aeration because air can actually pass through the sides of those clay pots. Again, they can be hard to clean. Metal can also work well, but metal heats in the sun. Fabric materials is great for aeration, but again, can dry out. Old tires, I'm not sure that's really something to think about. People have used all kinds of things over time to be containers. Some of them might not work as well as others, but a good flower pot that's either wood, metal, terracotta would work very, very well for a container. And you can do a lot of things with containers. You can move up, is the one on the left, and have different layers and levels growing your crops. And this works really well with small leafy crops and herbs. This looks like old barrels. They have cut the tops and the bottoms out and filled with soil or media and growing plants in. So you can do a lot of different things. Just like the raised beds, the size can be important. If you're growing lettuce, spinach, green onions, beets, you know, a half gallon to a gallon volume of potting material, potting media works really well. For bulb onions, Swiss chard, kohlrabi, turnips, you're going to need 2 or 3 gallons of material. Carrots, you're going to need some depth, up to 18 inches. But only a gallon or 2 of material is necessary. It can be a long, narrow container as long as it's deep enough for the carrots to develop. You'll need up to 5 gallons for cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, and kale. Beans, a couple of 3 gallons. You know, things like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, even your dwarf cherry, you need up to 5 gallons of volume. And they're going to need every bit of 10 to 8, well, up to 18 inches of rooting depth. You see folks use an old 5-gallon plastic bucket that works fairly well. You've got the volume and the depth. Just make sure it drains very well. Again, the soilless mixes work very well in containers. In fact, you probably want to go with a soilless mix, because one of the reasons you're going with containers is because they can be flexible. You would like to possibly be able to move them occasionally if you need to put them in light, or as the light changes. So a combination of peat, perlite, and vermiculite works very well. It helps with the drainage and the aeration. And these materials, if they are clean when they arrive, they can be pathogen free. And using the right material can also make the material or the media in the container lightweight, so it makes it much easier to handle the larger containers. The larger the containers, maybe that 5-gallon bucket, maybe some fine pine bark in place of the peat to help with the drainage that you will have to make sure they drain well. Some comments regarding cultivars and other things to consider. So the peat, the perlite, compost, etc., do not work well with your traditional soil test. Which means if you want to know if your raised bed is needing more fertilizer, you're going to need a special test from the soil lab. It's going to need a soilless media test. And that requires more material. It requires a gallon Ziploc bag full. And it is a little more, well, actually twice the cost of a traditional soil test, because it is a whole different set of materials they're having to deal with. Something to think about is something called the EC, or it's actually the salt level in the material. Particularly some compost can have a lot of salt content. And your soilless media test can help you determine. So be careful of the source of your compost. Something else to think about is if you do a test on the soilless media that you have in your containers, your raised beds, you're not going to get a straightforward, simple fertilizer recommendation. The soil test, we can give you a very straightforward, very accurate recommendation for a fertilizer application. But these materials, you don't get that straightforward of an answer. And the soil test lab is actually testing these on a large scale for commercial operations and greenhouses. So the scale in which they're making recommendations is going to be a lot different than what you will be doing at home. So a weekly dose of a soluble fertilizer or some type of slow release material may be your best bet. So there's some things to think about as you go with a soilless mix in your containers or your raised bed. So you've had a raised bed, and it's had material in the bed for a period of time. Do you reuse the material or not? Benefit of reusing the material is it's cheap. You don't have to buy as much to replace it. It's much easy to use if you just mix a little bit of new material. However, there are some disadvantages to doing this. Part of the reason you're wanting to replace the material or renovate the raised bed is because the material has settled. If it has settled, it is compacted, which means it has reduced the pore space and the water drainage has declined, and the air movement in the soil has decreased as well. If you have been fertilizing over time, there is a potential for the increase of increased levels of salt in the media. There's also a potential for diseases that can still be in the media or the mix. If you've grown tomatoes in the mix for a few years, you may have a buildup of pathogens that you would want to avoid. So there are some advantages to reusing your material and several disadvantages to reusing your material. Now, this is just an example of something called Wonder Walk. It's a multi-seeded pellet with several species of plants in one pellet. You simply mix, it's simple for a mixed container. You know, 4 pellets, it says, to a pot, and you can grow all the greens you need for a simple salad. So there's a lot of things on the market for these containers. Something else to think about, there are varieties now that are being developed that work very well in small spaces. The Muscati bean, which was a 2014 winner for the, I just went blank, it's the American Select winner, but it was a bean that only gets about 10 inches in width, so its space is 10 inches, and gets only about 10 to 20 inches in height, maybe up to 24 inches high. Matures in about 50 days, has about a 6-inch straight bean that's medium green in color. It doesn't get quite as big as your traditional bean species or bean varieties. So it works really well in a small area. A patio baby eggplant. You know, the fruit harvested at 2 to 3 inches in size. It is a thornless plant. The plant itself is only about 2 feet height at the most. And it can, over time, produce anywhere from 25 to 50 fruit per plant. So it's perfect for a container or a small raised bed area. And if you notice, you don't get a lot of fruit size-wise, but you get quite a bit of production over the season. Here is some pepper called Pretty and Sweet. It's a sweet-tasting ornamental pepper that comes, it's really a compact plant, about 18 inches of space, no staking or caging really necessary. About 60 days from the time you transplant, you start having peppers. And if you take care of it, it says 100 plus pepper pods per plant. So, you know, if you think about it, what they've tried to do with these small container or small space plants is to try to develop a plant that's not going to be very big, but it's going to provide you with plenty of harvest from one plant. And yes, Miss Leanne, it is the All-American Selections. I just went completely blank when it popped up on the screen. All-American Selections. Here is a tomato called Little Bean, a very compact, determinate tomato, prolific fruiting. And being a determinant, you've got a concentrated yield time. So the fruit's all going to come in a very, very short time. Here we have one called Tidy Rose. It's the indeterminate. It's a compact growing. You have a wider harvest period over the determinate one we just seen. It's only been out about 4 years, 3-4 years. It's pink flesh and a small slicing tomato, but it does really well in containers. Candy cane. It's a sweet pepper, variegated colored leaves, so it has a bit of an ornamental look to it. And the fruit can be striped green to red. So again, not only is this a plant that's going to produce you fruit, it may have some aesthetic value as well. And then there's plenty of herbs. Basil, chives work really well in part. The geisha garlic chives is what's listed here. And then basil, you can see the name there. I'm not going to try it. Dulce fresca. So a couple of options with your basil and your chives. And that's just a quick summary of the container plants. The All American Selections website can give you a lot more variety of choices and other plants that they have evaluated over time. If you've also had a chance to look at the UT variety trials, there are some of the plants that they haven't had in their trial gardens across the state that can be used in containers and raised beds to some great advantage. So when it comes to raised bed, no soil, no lawn, no, that's not really a problem. There's some more things you can do. Plan well. You're going to use a raised bed. If you think about and put a little time and money and effort up front, you can have a raised bed that will last quite a long time. The media is important. You do not want a media that's going to cause you more problems than you're trying to avoid by going with a raised bed or a container. So the spacing is, it says it's linked to the system and the crop and the cultivar. So how wide of the space between your beds, spacing within the beds, all depends on the crop that you're growing and the cultivars you choose and how you've laid out your entire system. When it comes to containers, they can be quite versatile, but can require a little bit more attention than a raised bed. But there are a lot of great options that you can grow in containers and raised beds. It's not going to take a lot of space, but still yield quite a bit of produce. So, any questions?
Sheldon?
Yes.
Ken and I were driving when you started your presentation, so we tried to listen really well, but some of it we did not able to hear. So you mentioned about the treated wood in the beginning.
Yes.
For a raised bed.
For a raised bed, did you say, we didn't hear well, whether the treated wood
Is the modern treated wood okay or not? I didn't quite understand that.
is it leaching out whatever they have in there,
The materials that they use now to treat wood does not leach as readily, nor is it as toxic as what they have used in the past. So what they are treating with now is better than what it was in the past. So the conclusion that we come to is, yes, it can be used, but that's up to you if you want to go that route, because there will still be some things leaching into the media. It's just not as toxic as the arsenic-based materials that they used in the past.
How about something like a railroad tie, the ones you see that look like they're all coated in tar and everything else? Do I want to stay away from that?
Railroad ties are treated with creosote and petroleum-based oils, so they are not the best option.
Okay, that's what I assumed, but I didn't know that.
Yeah, creosote is actually a natural material that comes from a plant, but the carrier is petroleum-based that they use to treat those railroad ties with. So no, I would not go with a railroad tie. Any other questions? All right, let's take a few minutes to talk about composting.
Can I ask another question before you get started on this
Sure.
section?
I'm still trying to get my controls set, so go ahead.
We're planning on building some raised beds, but we wanted to put a fence around it to keep out some of the animals. Is a 2x2 grid square on the wire big enough to keep the animals out? And what height would we need to keep the deer out?
You can actually keep the deer out with a relatively short fence if it's electric. And a 2x2 grid is just the perfect size for a rabbit or some other small mammals to get through. So at ground level, you're going to need something much smaller than 2x2 square.
Okay. And so a 4-foot fence is just inviting them to jump over it for the deer?
Yes. Now, it's interesting because deer can jump. It's amazing what they can do. They can jump over 8 feet high. So if the fence is 6 foot high, they can still clear it in some cases. And they can jump vertically from distance-wise quite a ways, but they can't cover height and distance in the same jump. So what a lot of folks will do is put up 2 fairly short fences and make them think that there's no way they can get up and over the fences. So that's one way. Actually, a couple of strands of an electric fence can work very well in deterring them. I've got some references I pulled for somebody a couple of days ago on deer fencing. I can include that with the notes that I send out with the end of the class materials, like I've been doing each week. We bring up questions, and I've been sending out the links to the different references. So I'll include deer fencing in there.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay, but I'm sorry, I seem to be, I'm so not knowing a lot of things. What do you mean by double fencing?
Well, you're going to put up one fence, and about 3 or 4 feet, you're going to put up another line of fence. So you've actually got two lines of fence that are spaced about 3 or 4 feet apart. So that's really gets to be expensive when you try to think about the materials that's going in those 2 fences. So there's still things you can do to deter them. And I was talking to a gentleman who's having some problems. He said, the fence isn't as high as you think it ought to be. He said, it just took me a season to figure out exactly how high the fence needed to be. And it needed to be visible, something that they could see that existed, so they knew there was a barrier there. He said after about a season or 2 of that being in the way, they kind of changed their travel patterns and went somewhere else. So he kind of broke them in the habit of coming through his garden. So you can do that and then the next time there's nothing to eat outside your garden and you've got a nice green leafy garden that's been watered well, they're going to find it if you're not careful. But there are some things that you can do to deter them.
Is there any plant you can plant that deer doesn't like, and the smell that deer doesn't like and will not come to your garden, or any, not fertilizer, but some kind of medicine you can put, or whatever, for lack of the better word?
There's really no plants that will deter them based on smell, but the smell of a person, people in that area. So you hear old timers talk about putting hair out. Scarecrow. Or a scarecrow, making them think there's somebody around. Scarecrows work the first day or 2, then they realize they don't move around the garden, and they come on in. Crows will figure out within an hour or 2 that they haven't moved, and will start using it as a roost instead. So it may be something you would move around the garden periodically. But there are some deer repellents that you can buy, products it comes with a tape that string, a plastic strip that you can tie around the top of your fencing and treat with these repellents. I know people that swear by them, and I've tried them. They seem to work really well till that first hard rain comes through. And a day or two after that, before the ground dries, you see more deer track through the garden than before. So you'd have to treat after every rain. So deer can be deer and raccoons and rabbits, groundhogs, coyotes can be a problem. They will actually eat watermelon. They actually love it. Chew and gnaw on it till they break the rind and then eat the insides. Coyotes will eat some of the other things. Dogs will like corn, so if they can get to the corn ear, they'll eat corn off the stalks. Cats will do the same thing. A lot of things will eat things in your garden besides you, and not just the bugs either. Several animals. So I will send the reference on deer fencing to everyone. Let's talk a little bit about composting. So what is composting? Well, it's the biological decomposition of organic material. And this decomposition takes place no matter what we do. We're just trying to harness that process so that we have an end product that we can use. So as noted here, compost is the end of all living things. So everything that's living and organic will decompose after death. The compost is simply a controlling of this process, where we try to manage the bacteria and fungi and other organisms that carry out the process of decomposition so that we have a end product. So a proper set of conditions are necessary for us to manage this process. In other words, we're going to be providing the bacteria, the fungi, and other organisms what they want so that they can eat and be happy and break down our waste products. The organic material that can be used as a soil amendment or a medium to grow plants is exactly what we want in the end. So we may ask, well, how do I know if it's going to be good soil amendment or if it's going to be good for growing plants? Well, if your finished product is no longer heating, you no longer can determine the source material. So you can't tell that it was a banana peel because it is decomposed enough. But it still looks like something that's like a mulch, and it makes a great mulch. If it looks more like soil or the potting mix you would buy in a store, then it would be great media for growing plants. So there's some chemistry involved in this as well as biology. So we want carbon and nitrogen to be added to our compost. So why do we want to do this? Well, compost can be used in a lot of different ways as a mulch and as a soil amendment. It can help maintain soil temperature, improve drainage for poorly drained soils. It can be a nutrient source, and it improves the soil structure. By adding organic matter, we can enhance qualities of the soil. We also think about this, it's going to help replenish the topsoil. So in many cases, the topsoil has either degraded, or if you're in a subdivision or an area that's been disturbed, it may have been removed. If you've got good topsoil, it's going to enrich the environment by providing nutrients and a diversity of organisms. The microorganisms that are in the soil, which then can help improve the soil quality. And it, again, improves water holding capacity. There's pictures to go with each of those. I should have kept clicking. You know, we talked about soil water holding capacity in a sponge as an example. Well, the organic matter is the sponge in the soil. A 1% increase in organic matter can improve your water storage by about 16,000 gallons per acre foot in the soil. So 1% increase in organic matter can, in an acre in the foot of depth, can add 16,000 gallons of capacity. So compost can add quite a bit to your soil. Another thing to think about and why in the composting is you're going to be diverting waste that would otherwise end up in a landfill. So that it is going to be an environmental friendly way of getting rid of certain waste. So let's step back just a second and look at its soil. We discussed this in the first or second of our series. So in most cases, the mineral content of the soil is about 45%. Water and air make up at least half of the composition of soil, that open space. Organic matter makes up about 5% of the soil. That includes the living roots of the plant, the microorganisms that is in the soil, and then a large part of that will be the humus, which is the degraded or decomposed organic matter from the roots and the microorganisms. So what we want to do is look at maintaining the organic matter or increasing the organic matter in our soil. Now, there's a lot of living components that make up the soil, and they're related to or dependent on each other for the health, their health, and in the long run, the health of the soil. These organisms make up only about 1% of the soil volume. So there are a lot of microorganisms in the soil, but they're, for total volume, a very small part of it. To give you a sense of just how rich and diverse this is in the soil, a teaspoon of healthy soil contains the following. So if I was in person, we could look at an actual teaspoon of soil, but get a teaspoon out and look, it's not a lot of material. Bacteria would be the most common organism that we would find, and that may depend upon the type of soil. And they're quite diverse and numerous. And some kinds of bacteria are responsible for converting atmospheric nitrogen to plant available forms. They're also responsible for decomposition. 250 million bacteria or more, depending on the soil. Fungi are another component, and we typically think of the mushrooms that appear at the top of the soil. That's just the tip of the iceberg. The mycorrhiza that form is the mostly in the soil can provide a lot of benefits for the plant roots by helping increase their uptake in nutrients. These filaments from the fungi, the mycorrhiza, can actually help the root hairs or bind substances together to help the plant take those materials in. It also binds soil particles together, which holds the particles together and creates structure. So they can be a very important part of the soil. Protozoa are single-celled organisms, quite mobile in the soil. They feed on bacteria and other little tiny organisms as well as each other. There may be thousands of them living in that teaspoon of soil. Protozoa release nitrogen that makes, and it becomes available to plants. 80% of the nitrogen in plants will come from either the bacteria or from protozoa eating the bacteria. So we've moved up the food chain just a little, and we are now moving up to nematodes. And as Tom Stebbins mentioned, they're very simple microscopic roundworms. And they have a lot of different ways of feeding. In temperate soils, some eat bacteria, others eat fungi or soil algae, and some will feed on your plants, piercing the plant cells and sucking out the plant contents. Some nematodes will eat each other or other nematodes and small invertebrates. So they could be very beneficial nematodes in the soil. Then we move up, there's earthworms. You know, these are actually the giants of the soil. They help mix and aggregate soil particles. They loosen the soil. They create deep, small tunnels, which help roots find, a channel to move through the soil, as well as improve drainage. They shred and bury plant residue that stimulates the microbial activity in the soil. And they consume tiny soil organisms and excrete even more microorganisms in their castings. And worm castings is actually sold from bait or worm farms that raise them for bait as a soil amendment. So they can, their castings can be a very good nutrient source. So there's a lot going on. You keep moving up the chain to much larger organisms, but a lot can happen even in a teaspoon of things. Over 4 million fungi, 10 million actinomycetes, 250,000 protozoa, and lots of small worms. So the composting process, let's actually look at this from a big picture and then we'll get a little more detailed. The things that you put in, the chemical makeup and the materials you put in, is really the engine, if you will, that drives this entire process. Organic materials go in like plants, along with water and oxygen. And these are the materials that support the living and breathing organisms that will consume the organic material. They will release heat, carbon dioxide, and of course, water. So what happens is when these are really well fed, things really heat up. The well-functioning compost system should have a temperature ranging from 90 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition, the pH of your compost will also change over time. So as things happen, the pH changes. Early in the decomposition stages, there's organic acids that are produced, which are quite favorable to the growth of fungi. And these fungi break down the really tough plant materials, the lignin and the cellulose, the wood chips, for example. And as the process continues, these organic acids are then neutralized with, the chemical processes that are taking place. So you end up with a pH of about 7 to 7.5. So you actually end up with a fairly neutral material. How long does this take? For a stable compost to be formed really depends on what takes place in the compost pile. If you have everything just right, and the conditions are perfect, It happens very, very quickly. So ideally, you'd like a mix of organics that contain a lot of carbon with a modest amount of nitrogen. And an easy way to divide up the carbon-heavy organics with the nitrogen-rich ones is to categorize them as greens and browns. The greens are the nitrogen. They break down easier and have more moisture and more nutrients. They are the compost workforce, so to speak. The browns contain more energy. They absorb excess moisture and they give quite a bit of structural strength to the compost pile. They also help keep the pile more porous, allowing air and water to move through the compost pile, and it keeps it from being compacted. So I'll give you some examples. Greens might include eggshells, coffee grounds, vegetable waste, and fresh grass clippings. You need to think about grass clippings, because if you've treated your yard for weeds, then grass clippings may not be the best choice for compost use in a garden. Your browns might include wood chips, shredded paper and leaves, pine needles, and straw. An ideal mix would be 30-1. So you want 30 brown to 1 nitrogen. So you would have to come up with a mix of these materials that would give you that ratio of carbon to nitrogen. That can be easily done. You know, grass clippings and leaves, typically if you collect the leaves in the fall of the year off of your yard with a mulching mower, you eventually will end up with about a 30 or so to 1 mix. Now, if you have just straight leaves or just straight pine needles, that doesn't work as well. And I can't remember the university off the top of my head, but there's a couple of universities that have a calculator. You say, I have X amount of these materials, and it will tell you how much you can mix of each of these materials together to get to 30-1. The compost material doesn't have to be exactly 30-1. If it's 29-1 or 31-1, it'll work just as well. So you're looking at a good mix. You know, eggshells, you know, coffee grounds, tea leaves, those are pretty obvious. When it comes to vegetable waste, the uncooked is the best. If it's boiled or baked, it might be fine. If it's fried, you probably don't want all that grease and oil. You don't want all that grease and oil in your compost pile. Wood chips, the limbs and twigs that fall around the house, chip it up, break it up in small pieces and use those. Paper, this newspaper and printer paper would work. Shredded paper, the paper towels that you use to clean up, you know, after dinner in the kitchen, as long as they're not soaked in oil, work really well. And the problem with these materials is, you know, paper, if you get a lot of paper, it's going to hold a lot of moisture, absorb a lot of moisture. So while it may compost readily, it can make for a very compact and not very porous compost pile. So you may want to mix something bulkier with shredded paper. There's a lot of things to think about, but if you get the right mix, it's going to work quite well. There are things that should not be composted. They should not go into your compost pile. Dairy products. They create odor problems and attract rodents and flies. Your fats, grease, oils, lard, so on, again, create odor problems and attract pests such as rodents and flies. These greases and oils can also deter water from moving through your compost. Meats and seafood scraps. Again, you have an odor problem, and probably every neighborhood cat and dog would show up to your compost pile if you use meat and seafood scraps in your compost pile. Pet waste, such as litter from your dogs or cats, should not be used. They contain parasites, bacteria, and germs and pathogens, viruses that can be harmful to humans. So grass clippings were a great source of green material, but if those clippings are from a yard that's been treated, you do not want to use them in your compost pile. Perennial root weeds with roots, or perennial weeds with seed. If your compost pile does not get hot enough to kill the seed, all you're doing is providing that weed with a perfect growing environment when you spread it back out in your garden. So your perennial weeds have potential for propagating the weeds instead of solving your weed problem. Charcoal ash, or coal ash even, this is something you might want to think about because there could be substances that are harmful to plants. A lot of your charcoal now comes pre-treated for easy lighting, and those chemicals can be a problem. It says black walnut leaves or twigs. These substances might be harmful to plants. There's a lot of studies been going on about whether or not this is the case. It seems that the certain parts of the walnut tree does exude a chemical called jugulan, which will keep other plants from growing well or growing at all near them. And some plants are more sensitive to this than others. This is a compound that does break down over time. So black walnut leaves in a compost pile over a course of a couple of years, deteriorating, would break down the material. Invasive plants like privet, they can be a seed source. And again, just like the perennial weeds that we mentioned before, you can be propagating a problem instead of solving it. So these are some things not to put into your compost pile. Animal manures. There's several things again that could be a problem from bacteria and parasites or pathogens. So you do not want to necessarily be adding these animal manures to your compost. Plants that have been diseased. So if you pull a tomato out that has a problem, you do not want to put it in your compost pile because the pathogens will stay in the compost and infect tomatoes later on. So there's things that you need to avoid in your compost pile. A mixture of green and brown ingredients in the right mix of those ingredients, some proper aeration, some good moisture, and a container for composting your materials. And that can be optional. So the first thing we want to consider doing is shredding the larger pieces to expose more surface area. So the more surface area, the microbes can attack and break it down faster. So the smaller the particles, the faster they will decompose. Will it decompose without you shredding it and making it smaller? Well, absolutely. It just simply will take longer. Water is key to the functioning of your compost pile. Too little, and the microorganisms that carry out the decomposition will slow down or even die off. Too much and you drown them. So you want a compost pile that feels damp. You might get a little water out of it if you were to squeeze it. So 40 to 60% of the compost pile by weight is what you want to add. So you want to sprinkle the water or spray the water over it. Never dump the water into the compost pile. Give it an opportunity to saturate and to move through the compost pile evenly. These are living organisms and they do need oxygen to do their job. So keep the pile turned. A shovel or pitchfork works really well. The amount you turn the pile may vary. Too much turning, well, you're going to cool it down and slow down the process. But if you don't turn it enough, the process turns anaerobic. And anaerobic means without oxygen. And you will know if your compost pile goes anaerobic because it will smell terrible. So finding that right mix of material size, particle size, moisture, and turning is key to a healthy compost. In general, a compost pile should be located in a well-drained area that is sheltered from the winds. You're going to need an area where you will eventually have a pile that is 3 by 3 by 3. This is large enough so that it can retain the heat, but small enough so that air can move through and water move through the entire pile. It needs to be partly sunny to a little shady because you get too much sun, it'll dry the pile out too quickly. However, you may need to be thinking about water occasionally, even if it is in the full shade or in the shade. Now, too much shade can likewise slow down the composition process. So you want a partly shady area. You do not want to be in an area near or under trees because the roots will absolutely love growing into your compost pile. Make sure you have a water source that's close by because we've already talked about how important maintaining the moisture is. So you need access to the water. Be considerate of your neighbors. If you have a compost pile, you want to make sure that it's working right so that it doesn't have any foul odors. And if you do happen to have a pile that goes anaerobic or doesn't smell good, your neighbors might not like it. Okay, so a general layering approach can be taken in your compost pile, simply layering your browns with your greens. And this creates a compost in a rather short period of time. And may actually be a little bit of a slower process, but it works really well. So keep in mind that you'll need to turn this in about every 2 to 5 days, depending on how it heats. Water as needed, keeping it lightly moistened. There are some other approaches that you can use. And this is a recipe that outlines a fast approach. You need to select the right site again that's well drained, partial to full sun. 3 by 3 area. First step is to increase the aeration in your pile. You can drive 3 to 6 posts at the side of your compost pile. These will eventually be taken out at the end of your layering process, but it's going to give you the support you need to develop your pile. You choose to skip inserting the poles, that's fine, but you'll be turning them if you use this process. For the first layer, add about a half a foot or about 6 inches of the browns. So something like leaves or wood chips, pine needles. As you place the next layer, about 4 inches of greens. This could be the grass clippings or your coffee grounds or vegetable materials. Then add about 2 inches of native soil to this. And then keep building your layers. Back up here just a second. So as you build each of your layers, you're going to develop a pile that will work very well. The reason you add the 2 inches of soil is you're adding the microbial inoculant. It's not absolutely necessary for you to apply the soil into the layer, but it might help speed the process up. 3 to 6 inches, of browns followed by more greens. These are approximate. You don't have to get them exactly right. After trying it a couple of times, you probably find the right mix of layering. A bit of a slower approach is to add as you go. And you may not have the ideal layers or the ideal thicknesses, but it still contains a nice mix of the brown and greens. And this is a bit more practical, particularly if you're doing it more as an alternative to going to the landfill or using the compost to just amend periodically your garden. If you don't have enough initial organic materials, you may want to stockpile those materials before building your compost pile. So you may have a pile of wood chips or a pile of leaves that you've collected before you start adding the materials. Occasionally, you're going to need to turn your compost pile and mix these different levels in. And again, water as needed. Temperature. Your soil or your compost getting to the 90 to 140 degrees we mentioned earlier is going to be a function of the size of the pile, the age of the pile, how big the particles are that you have added, the right mix of carbon to nitrogen, and your moisture content. Also the atmospheric temperature. If it's a cold winter day, it's not going to get as hot. And whether or not the pile is aerobic, anaerobic, or aquatic. So if you've got it drowned, it's certainly not going to heat. There's a mesophilic phase where the temperature rises to about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. This will last about 2 to 3 days. And if you've got the right mix of carbon and nitrogen materials, it's going to happen within the first 2 or 3 days. It's going to happen relatively quickly. Then it reaches a thermophilic phase where the temperatures can reach close to 170 degrees. When most decomposition takes place, and this is a very critical period. Most anaerobic decomposers die at temperatures of about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Seed, most of those will be killed at about 160 degrees. And this could last for quite some time. So as things decompose, your compost pile can stay warm or hot for several weeks. Once the decomposition is complete, the temperature will stabilize and drop. The microorganisms will return to the compost pile. And this state will last until the pile is disturbed or you utilize the compost. So this gives you a graphic view of the process. The temperature remains fairly moderate. First few days spikes at the end of those first week. It stays fairly warm for several weeks sometimes before it begins to cool down. As it does this, the pH in the compost pile will start to increase as well. So a lot can happen in that compost pile, both physically and chemically throughout the process. So a hot pile has about a 20-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. It results in temperatures that kill most disease pathogens. If the temperature reaches about 130 degrees, about 15 minutes is about all it takes for these pathogens to be killed. And temperatures can spike to higher than that 130 degrees. They can spike up to 150 degrees before they begin to drop in a pile that's with this 20-to-1 mix. And when the temperature starts to drop then in this fast decomposition process and hot compost pile, the temperature drops to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, then you can turn the pile and it will stabilize and you have your compost that's ready to go. However, it's quite difficult to manage a compost pile that will result in the death of weed seeds and pathogens. It's very hard to get that right mix of all the ingredients, temperature and the air, moisture, and so on. So there can be some challenges to accomplishing that. That's why we do not recommend you putting the weeds and the diseased plants in. Okay, the other thing to think about too is it says the challenge results in the recommendation to not include raw manures in the compost pile. And that's partly because of the way in which they decompose. A lot of your manures, if you allow them to age properly, and it may take 2 or 3 months for them to age, they will do so naturally on their own. A cold pile, there can be really no noticeable change in the temperature. Things still decompose, but quite slowly. It may take 6 months or even more time for this to take place. And if you have a cold compost pile, if you happen to toss something in it that has seeds like pepper seed or something, or tomato seed from your kitchen, then you're going to possibly see them even sprout in your compost pile. So the seeds and pathogens will not be killed. But this is a process that can actually be easier to maintain for most people. And that's simply because of the scale and the time that it takes. So keep in mind as well that there's different ways to do this. Aerobic bacteria increases decomposition by as much as 90%. That's why aeration is important. These bacteria that need oxygen, they metabolize a lot quicker and require more food than the anaerobic. So make sure that the compost pile is well aerated so that you don't kill off the bacteria you really, really need. The pile needs to be turned about every 3rd day. It might be necessary for you to add materials that are bulky, such as sticks, small sticks, or wood chips. Build your pile around a PVC pipe with holes in it. Poke holes in the pile. Just go along and just take a pitchfork or a shovel and dig holes in it. poke and stir the pile occasionally, just something to stir the process up. Pile should be between 40 to 60% water so that it feels wet when it's touched. I've already mentioned that too little, they dehydrate. Too much, it's sour or soggy pile, basically drown what you're trying to grow, and it gets a little nasty. Use a screen to sift the compost to remove any large materials that may need to go back into the compost pile. And you're ready to use it. So if you have problems with your compost pile, there's some things you may need to do. If it smells rotten, it's really too wet, or it's compacted, turn it and add a porous material. If it has a strong ammonia smell, that means there's too much nitrogen or not enough carbon. So sawdust, wood chips, straw would add a carbon source to it. If it's not hot enough, it may be too small, not getting enough air movement. It may be too little nitrogen, or it could simply be the fact it's too cold outside. So in that case, you may need to increase the size of the pile, turn it occasionally, add more greens, or add a layer of straw to insulate the compost pile. It's getting too hot, over 160 degrees is considered hot. The pile may be too large, which needs to be reduced in size, or again, poor ventilation. So you may need to turn it more often so that it will cool. You can have your compost tested. There are options there. Again, it is going to be the soilless organic test, which is a little more expensive, but you can find out quite a bit about the compost and what is in it, such as and find out the pH level, the micronutrients, phosphorus and potassium in particular, as well as calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. So, which is the best compost system for you? How much waste do you have for composting? Do I want to compost the food scraps? How quickly do I want the compost to be ready for use? Is it important that the system be neat and tidy? And how accessible do I want it to be to my house? So those are some things to think about. And you can find compost bins in all kinds of different arrangements that can be closed structures that you can spend quite a bit of money for. You can build bins out of old pallets very inexpensively and work very well. Or you can just have an open pile where you start with a base of loose or browns such as leaves and mix in the greens and other materials as you have them. So this could be a problem because it just may not look very good. It takes quite a while for it to decompose. And it can be susceptible to wildlife tampering. So if you bury food scraps in the piles, it's going to be very easy for something to dig it out. So an open pile, while quite functional, may have some disadvantages. The homemade bins out of, say, pallets look neater. They hold a shape and will allow the microbial activity to increase. It does have the disadvantage of allowing access to animals. Whereas these closed systems can be quite nice looking and maybe acceptable for appearance purposes. You have a very controlled environment. There's really not much in the way of wildlife tampering with the compost pile. Process of very small volume, so it may not work or have as much material as the bins in the middle or the open pile on the left. These structures can be expensive as well. Something else about some of those enclosed structures or batch composters is they are designed to compost a batch at one time. They don't work very well if you're adding ingredients over a period of time. Your bins, your open bins, such as the one in the middle, or your open pile, works a lot better if you're building it over time. But if you have all the ingredients at one time, they work really well in a batch composter or some type of structure. You can find some of these structures that you can layer over time in that do fairly well. You can build your own salvage pallets. The 3-bin system here that they've laid out. You know, it's pretty easy to build. They come in pallets come in all different sizes and quality. Some have really wide gaps in the wood. Others can be quite tight in the gaps. Wood pallet bins such as these can be a great way to stockpile materials. Do you have enough to build your compost pile? You know, there's some problems with heat retention and such with these. Again, the materials the pallet's made out of might be an issue. The 3-bin system, which is pictured here at the bottom, it may look like a log cabin or a box, and it works very well. They can be very cumbersome in accessing the soil because there's really no door built in. You have to pull these slats up to get access to it. Those built with a lattice work, they often look nice, but the pre-made lattices can be pretty fragile. So you may want to think about the thickness of this material. Some other options would be wire bins using field fencing or wire fencing, rabbit wire. Very inexpensive. The piles heat a little more slowly. They can attract rodent and pest. So you may need to put a cover over the top. Now, most people tend to create their wire bin too large. And if they're too big, you don't really have enough material to fill it. So it may look like you don't have much of a compost. It can also be a great way of stockpiling leaves and grass clippings. So you can have materials to build a compost. Blocks can be used to create. You do not want to be cemented together, just simply stacked. But if they aren't cemented, they can shift and collapse and fall, so that can be a problem. Other problems could be scavenger access. They don't retain heat very well, or they do retain heat very well. So they again may be best for stockpiling. The old-fashioned trash can, it has a good secure lid. Drill holes in the side for air ventilation and in the bottom for drainage. Monitor for proper moisture. Locate the bin in hot, direct sun for a long time could actually heat the pile hotter than you would want. It can even cause it to explode. So, you know, the heat, the gas built up and the lid securely put on could be an issue. Limited in volume and something like this. So there's a lot of ways you can build a pile and a lot of things that might work. You're just going to have to think about what would work for you. You have all kinds of commercial products that are out there. Again, when you think about buying a commercial composter, think about whether or not it has the volume to meet your needs. access to the contents, both for turning and for removing the finished product. Make sure you can easily get in with a shovel. How well does it hold heat? Will there be good air circulation? Have some type of ventilation system? How resistant is it to wildlife, scavengers? And what does it look like? Just the aesthetics can be something to think about. But the earth machine, the soil maker, the green cone are all variations of this idea of commercial composters. This green cone is for food waste, and they tout the fact that it'd be really good for composting food scraps, and do so for an average family of 4. No turning or maintenance is needed except once every year or so. It can be pest free. So they seem to think that there's something like this will work very well. It's also about $160 for a 52 cubic foot cone. That stands about 27 inches high, 24 inches in diameter at the base. So you're spending a lot of money for this. There's other variations of this. The lifetime tumbler for $150, $250, compost about 80 gallons of material. You'll generally find these online and available at big box stores if you want to shop around. Again, think about the volume. How much is it going to cost you? Access to the contents. How easy would it be to add material to the composter as well? So how will we use this compost? Well, one way is as a soil amendment. You can cover the area to be amended with about 4 inches of compost prior to tilling. And over time, it will improve soil tilth, water holding capacity, and other characteristics of the soil. You use it as a planting medium. So a mixture of 4 parts compost with 1 part sand makes for a good starter medium or plant medium. And you can also grow plants in it. So you can be very successful in raised beds with at least 6 inches of depth of compost. Something a 12-inch deep composted raised bed with compost will work really well for Irish potatoes and sweet potatoes, carrots, and turnips. So those root crops do really well in a deep raised bed. You can use it as a mulch. We talked about the benefits of mulching a couple of weeks ago, and compost can be a mulching material. There are some problems if you use compost too heavily. Soluble salts can build up in the soil. Organic matter and excessive water holding capacity. So you can actually overdo the water holding capacity if it holds too much water. And in so doing, you increase the risk of certain plant diseases. You also need to realize that the compost is a nutrient rich material. So by adding it to the soil, you're fertilizing. You can build up the nutrients in the soil to an extremely high level, which causes problems in the soil as well. Now, there's some myths and some realities when it comes to compost use. The beneficial microorganisms compete with soil pathogens. And that's not necessarily the case, but we are trying to provide a environment where the plant is going to be as healthy, as vigorous as it possibly can be, and then be able to ward off any pathogens that try to attack it. So we're after healthy plants. But compost is not the cure-all to the problems of a garden. There's a Tennessee Smart Yards composting PowerPoint that was used in this, as well as Master Gardener Handbook. So there are materials that are available that goes into more detail on composting. So we'll end my slideshow there. And I saw some questions popping up. Yeah, I mentioned paper works really well, and Stephanie's right. Glossy or colored papers are probably not the best choices. Newspaper works really well. Horse manure, chicken manure, and cow manure work very well in gardens. Adding them to your compost is really not going to be much benefit to your compost. So the best thing to do with the horse manures, chicken manures, cow manures is if you have a place to stockpile them, and just let them naturally age on their own, not necessarily be mixed into your compost pile. In about 60 to 90 days of weathering, you're going to have a good material that can be used as a soil amendment. Or you can take the raw manure itself as soon as it comes out of the barn or out of the chicken coop and apply it directly to the soil and incorporate it in. Realize that if you do that, you're probably going to be about 90 to 120 days before you can start growing crops in there, because the manure is going to have to break down in the soil, and it's going to pull nutrients out of the soil for its decomposition process. And it's going to get a little hot for some plants, a little too much nitrogen for it to be available. So it's a really good thing to add in the fall of the year and incorporate it in and let it lay fallow through the winter. So while manures, particularly from cows, horses, and chickens, work really well, just don't necessarily need to be added to your compost pile. And somebody mentioned that chickens and cows work, the manure works really well, but they do eat plants and weeds. And those weed seeds are designed to pass through those animals' digestive systems so they can be planted in a very nutrient-rich environment to sprout and grow. So that can be a problem from using manures if you're not careful. Any other questions as we wrap up our session and our series?
Sheldon, if you stockpile those manures, the chicken and the other manures, if you stockpile them, let's say you want to wait for 3 months, wouldn't the rain wash them off? Like the nutrients wash off?
You're going to lose a little, but not enough to be really a problem.
Okay.
What you're wanting is for it to age. And actually, manures, particularly cow manures and chicken manures, are pretty high in nitrogen. They can be a little high, and that can be a problem because nitrogen can burn plants and cause problems with the plant if there's too much. So your phosphorus and your potassium, they are not very mobile at all. So you're not going to lose any of those. What nitrogen you're going to lose during that process is probably not going to be a problem in the long run, because you're getting the nitrogen levels down to a level you can manage in the soil. Straight manure to a plant is not going to benefit the plant. It causes more damage.
Okay, thank you.
Also, some of the, our property doesn't have a lot of trees in it. It's more like just kind of around the edges.
Right.
But our neighbor has a lot of several black walnut trees. And our property was covered with a lot of weeds before we bought the land and kind of cut it down. So how do I know how to use like the leaves and the grass clippings if they're going to have still may have seeds in them from the weeds and may have his black walnut tree and stuff?
I don't think the black walnut issue is as bad as some reports have suggested, particularly if the leaves have naturally fallen because they lose their chemicals. And over a course of the winter, they're going to break down. The compounds are going to break down. So what I would think about doing, if I've got a lot of weedy plants in my yard where I would mow, and with the leaves, I'd still collect that and compost it, but I would use it as the filler in the yard and use it as a top dressing in the yard itself. So you're putting the material back where it came from. It would not be if you get the weeds under control, then you won't be adding that many weed seed back. One of the best things you can, for a garden compost pile, is to think about the wood chips, straw, sawdust. It can even be fairly new, fresh sawdust. And then a lot of the old plants that come out of the garden that are not diseased. So your corn stalks, your okra stalks, your cabbage leaves. If you harvest the cabbage head, and you've still got the root and a few leaves left, and pull that out. Those materials compost very well. Then if you pick beans and shuck the corn, you've got the strings from your beans and your corn shucks, all of which would compost very well. And most of those would not have a lot of disease problems that would go back in the garden. Apple peels, banana peels, coffee grinds, and tea leaves also compost very, very well in a compost pile. And if you build your compost pile and do some experimenting with the right mix of materials, and you can get your compost piles to heat to 140 degrees, then you're going a long way to killing a lot of the problems in the compost pile, the weed seed and the pathogens. I said a compost pile can go up to 170 degrees. Sometimes can peak at 170. Some of them can peak at higher temperatures than that. And you think about it, the temperature we are recommended to cook meat to is 165, 170 degrees, depending on the type of meat. And the reason is to kill pathogens. So your compost pile, if it's working right, will literally cook the compost and solve a lot of your problems. So
did I remember from a previous episode that we should not be putting citrus things in our compost pile, or am I misremembering?
Well, it depends on who you ask. Citrus materials can be a bit acidic and can be slow to decompose. So some folks don't recommend it, but if you've got a well-working compost pile, an occasional orange peel is not going to cause you a whole lot of problems. But they do contain chemicals that resist the decomposition of more so than other materials, just that citric acid and oils that in them. So I've put orange peels in a compost pile, and they eventually break down over time. It just may take longer than some of the other things that go in the compost pile. I put a link in the in the chat for a survey with the last 3 classes of the series, so you can let me know what you think about the classes and the materials we've covered. If you go, I was going to see if I can pull this up real quick. Yes. While you're opening and entering the questions on the chat. You all see the screen that says UT Hort?
Yes.
There's a lot of information, the trial garden information can be found there with the varieties that they recommend. Scroll over, you'll find a section on vegetable gardening and several references to vegetable gardening. And there's a way to search the website. So if you put in compost, it talks about some of the things you can do for composting, getting the most out of your potting mix. This home composting guide can give you more details on materials to add, not add to your compost. And there was one. Ah, yes. This home guide to managing yard waste goes to University of Kentucky publication, and from there you can find how to mix the different ingredients that you have.
Hey, Sheldon.
Yes.
Back to that, you said we could use the corn stalks and the okra stalks and
Yes.
bean bushes and all that. Is it a safe assumption that that we should run those through a wood chipper or something to get them down to smaller sizes? I'm sure it wouldn't take nearly as long to pump them.
It would certainly speed up the process.
Yeah.
So yes, breaking them up into much smaller pieces would definitely be a good thing to do. I've done it both ways. Just lay down the corn stalks on a layer, put sawdust on top, and just kept building the layer up as I went. And it took it almost a year to fully decompose, but it did over time. And I wasn't too worried about how long it took. So it can be done.
If we can use the cobs and the shuck and all, right?
Yes. Yeah, all that would work.
Yeah.
Just realize it's the bigger pieces, they just be slower to decompose.
Right.
But the only thing, coming out of your garden that you don't want to put would be the tomatoes that are and peppers that are diseased, or any vegetable crop that's been diseased. If there's healthy plants when you harvest, then they can easily be composted. Here we go. Under the files, save your leads for some green. Check out this compost calculator. And it is actually from Washington. But you can add, and it does have manures listed here, but let's say we went with office paper and coffee grounds. Gives you the mix, the available carbon to nitrogen ratio. So if you put in 1 cubic foot of coffee grounds, we're going to need about 10 parts. No. Well, a 1-to-1 mix of office paper and coffee grounds give you a 22-to-1 mix. So we're in the okay range, but we could do a little better. So let's so 2 parts office paper to 1 part coffee grounds by volume, we give you that nice 30-to-1 mix. So you can play with these numbers with the different things you have ingredients for, and they do include the manures. Sometimes they can be a little smelly in a compost pile. Cardboard is going to be one of your higher carbon contents, whereas some of your manures are going to have your lowest carbon to nitrogen ratio. Somebody mentioned chickens. So let's so you got 2 parts office paper to 1 part office paper to 2 parts chicken. Anyway, you can see if you just keep adding the numbers, it will change your mix until you get that right combination. It's there we go. So it's going to be about 9 parts office paper to 1 part chicken manure. Maybe 10 parts paper to 1 part poultry manure to give you that mix that you're looking for. So that, I found that calculator pretty interesting and a good way to figure out based on the ingredients you have to try to get that nice, good mix of 30-to-1 that makes for a good, sustained composting process. And you can add up to 4 ingredients. So any other questions or thoughts? Feel free to send me. You've got my email, so you can email me. So if you've not filled out the survey, please do so with the link that I put in the chat. And if there is no other questions, enjoyed the last 6 weeks and wish you all the best of luck in your garden. And hopefully we get to see each other face to face. Don't forget, April 17th is one of our master gardening programs, and I'll email the details. And then hopefully this summer we may get together for another in-person session.